Seeing is believing, right? How many times in the discussions about the paranormal and other mysteries of the world have I heard someone say, "I'd have to see that for myself to believe it." And I think to myself, if it were only that simple. But of course it's not. Existence is a lot more complicated than just seeing something. It's not that cut and dry, and there's a whole process behind it that we have to keep in mind every time we make a determination about anything in our world. And this is even more important for paranormal and cryptid investigators. We have to be the most sensible of all in what we think we see. Now check out this photo that's been circulating for years on the internet. What do you see? Do you see a rabbit? Or do you see a duck? What you see at first depends on how your mind works. What about this one? Don't get excited, it's just a lamp. But can you understand what I'm saying? Many things can be interpreted in different ways. Psychiatrists have been using ink blot pictures in this way for years to interpret a patient's state of mind. It's a great way to spot a person's obsessions, perceptions, and sometimes their delusions. It tells immediately what their mind is mainly focused on. Because that thing we focus on is what we create in front of us. It becomes our reality, and that's how we'll actually see it. So we have to be very careful to think harder about what we're seeing. And you may have noticed this in the past with 100 other visuals and didn't give it much thought, but this is a really big deal. It impacts how we view reality, so it impacts everything in our lives. The moment we wake up in the morning, we start to make decisions about what we're seeing. If it's something familiar, we don't question it. If it's something strange, our brain has to process it. And it does that by trying to relate it to something familiar to the observer. And those of us in paranormal and cryptid research need to be aware of the implications and why this is such a big deal to understand. But what does this mean to those of us who study the undiscovered and the unknown? It means that there can't possibly be one absolute reality that all of us recognize in exactly the same way. There's only our personal perception of it. So everything we see is determined by our mind's interpretation. And we all have a slightly different interpretation because we've all lived a different life and experienced things differently. So in the rabbit-duck picture, what are we really seeing? The answer is, it's a rabbit. And it's also a duck, basically depending on what you, from past experiences, expect to see. So what's up with this? First of all, we don't really see things with our eyes. Our eyes are merely a lens, like a camera lens. We actually see with the part of our brain known as the visual cortex. And whenever we see anything, the visual cortex is making its interpretation based on past experiences. It has programmed itself based on that past information. So our eyes are only serving as the conduit for the brain. They're the instruments that deliver the information that will be processed by the brain. The eyes and the mind are profoundly connected. The eyes are an integral part of the brain, and the brain plays an integral role in our vision. The two can't be separated when it comes to perceptions. For example, if your experience of seeing a dog for the first time is seeing it lunging towards you, growling and snapping, that has a certain impact on your brain. It records in your mind that dogs are evil, growling, biting monsters you should always avoid. And the next time you see a dog, you react with fear because of that early experience. But alternatively, if you grew up in a house full of cuddly puppies, of course you'll have a completely different view of dogs. And the kicker is you'll have a really hard time understanding the other person's fear of them. You won't have had that experience, so your reality is different. And this complete difference in perception of the same subject can be the mother of all debate about just about everything in the world in which people disagree, including, of course, cryptozoology and the paranormal. Our brain is wired to try to associate everything we see with something familiar. And what that vision or event will mean to us is based on experiences we've had of it before. Whenever we see or experience something, our brain is recording it for future reference. If it's something new we've never seen or experienced, you can bet our brain is busy taking notes, trying to process it all and save it. But this is why we often become dumbfounded, and time seems to move slower when we see something we can't process. Our brain actually has to slow it down in order to get a grasp on it. But once it does, it's stored forever. The worlds of forensic and criminal justice have become increasingly more wary of eyewitness accounts and will, in addition, search for other more tangible evidence to back them up. Why? Because we're learning that what we see is very much controlled by what we think and how we think about it. So eyewitness testimony is becoming less and less reliable. Now, I've brought this subject up before in paranormal circles, only to receive messages and emails from people asking me why I don't believe they saw what they saw. But it's not that I don't believe those stories. In fact, I believe them very much. But now we know there's a lot more to seeing than just your eyes, and we can use that information to our advantage. We can forge a lot more logic and common sense to what we're trying to accomplish in solving the world's mysteries. But this revelation about reality should have thrown the world on its ear, yet it hasn't so far. And why not? Because we're not quite grasping the implications. It could go as far as to mean the line between what's real and what isn't as clearly defined. They're all open to the interpretation of the viewer. We've all been taught to think that one person is right and one person is wrong. But if we're all seeing the reality based on our personal experiences, then who's really right and who's wrong? Those questions become harder to answer. Sure, you'll agree with the person who sees things the same way you do, but knowing all this, does that method of decision really seem as concrete now? How do we decide? Now, I'll say again that this doesn't mean I don't believe in anything. Quite the contrary. But we have to be very aware of how our brains process information, and we need to take that into account when we decide what we're seeing in front of us. How many different ways could this be interpreted? Think it through. Always try to be logical. And that being said, some things we see still defy logic. That's the world I live in, at least. Somewhere beyond the fringes, trying to figure out all the weird stuff. So in relating this to Bigfoot and paranormal research, I would say this. When we're doing research, or just trying to decide what's real, we need to be aware that we can't really rely on our eyes to tell us some absolute truth. More importantly, we need to remember that our eyes won't tell us an absolute truth that everyone should recognize in the same way we do. Everyone will see something different. That's just the way we're designed. And we need to remember that before we start an argument. We have to learn to be objective and skeptical of our own initial thoughts. Not only do we have to question what we see, but we have to question what we think about it. But that being said, that doesn't mean our eyes are always lying either. It may just mean the world isn't quite as black and white as we'd like to think. But those of us in the cryptozoology and the paranormal are more capable of understanding that better than anyone. This is Dorraine Fisher with the Crypto Crew around the campfire.